Picture her, a young woman of 22, standing alone in the cruel hush of falling snow before the great shut doors of Blackmore Hall. A brown leather suitcase at her feet, a thin shawl about her shoulders. Chestnut auburn curls loosening from their pins, catching the flakes like a crown of small cold stars. Behind her, every window of the vast stone house burns with firelight she is no longer permitted to warm her hands upon. Before her, a drive half a mile long, a gate of iron, and beyond that, England in winter. Her name was Lady Isolde Ashworth, Duchess of Blackmore. She had been accused of a sin she had not committed, cast out by a husband who had never once asked whether she loved him, and she carried beneath the pink silk of her bodice a secret that might have saved her, if only she had been given the chance to speak it. 3 months. A child. His child. And the man who had turned her out into the snow would, before the next winter ended, ride the length of England to find her. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Now, let us go back to the beginning of the long, cold year, when everything she had quietly loved began to fall apart. The ballroom at Blackmore Hall was ablaze that autumn night, and one could be forgiven, standing in its great double doors, for imagining that happiness still lived within its walls. 10 chandeliers burned overhead, each a constellation of wax candles. The parquet floor, polished with beeswax until it shone like a frozen pond, reflected the gold of the light and the hems of 100 gowns. In the gallery above, a string quartet coaxed a slow minuet from its instruments, and below, the guests of the late autumn hunting party turned in measured circles, their laughter the practiced laughter of people who had never had to earn a shilling. At the edge of the dancing, in a small gilt chair half sheltered by a pillar of Italian marble, sat the Duchess of Blackmore. She wore a gown of pale rose-pink silk, empire-waisted with puff sleeves and a square neckline trimmed in hand-stitched lace. A gold locket lay at her throat. Her gloved hands were folded precisely in her lap. Her spine was straight. Her chin was lifted. Her emerald eyes watched the floor as a hawk watches a clearing, and saw everything. She saw her husband. Sebastian Blackmore, Duke of Blackmore, stood in the bright centre of the room, and beside him, very nearly beneath the crook of his arm, stood Lady Cassia Vane. Cassia wore ivory and gold, and her ruby earrings caught the candlelight with a malice all their own. Her raven hair had been pinned into tight ringlets at the temples, and she laughed in a manner engineered, over years, to carry. She laid one gloved fingertip upon the Duke's sleeve, where the silver embroidery ran about his cuff, and let it linger. "You are cruel, Your Grace," Cassia said, "to tell a lady she may not ride with you in the morning, because she cannot keep pace." "You might take it as a compliment to my horse," Sebastian said, "or as an invitation to prove myself." He smiled. Not broadly. Sebastian Blackmore had never, within Isolde's memory, smiled broadly, but enough. Enough that the corners of his firm mouth lifted, enough that his steel-grey eyes warmed a half-degree, enough that the movement was visible across a crowded room to a woman who had spent 2 years memorizing his face. Isolde did not weep. She had learned in those 2 years not to weep in company. Tears were for the pillow after midnight and for the small stone chapel in the east wing, where no servant thought to look before matins. In the ballroom, a duchess smiled the faint, unbothered smile of a woman above such matters, and she folded her hands, and she watched, behind her chair, a slight creak of boards, Mrs. Margaret Holloway, 52, and built like a stout churchyard yew, stood with her hands clasped before her crisp white apron. She did not speak. She did not touch her mistress. She merely placed herself, as she had placed herself 1,000 times, between Isolde and the world. "My lady," Mrs. Holloway said at last, very low, "may I fetch you a glass of ratafia?" "No, thank you, Holloway. A turn upon the terrace, perhaps. The air is close. I am quite well." "You are pale, my lady. I am always pale," Isolde said, and the smallest tremor in her voice betrayed her. "It is the common failing of my complexion." Mrs. Holloway did not answer. She only shifted her weight a half-inch nearer, and that was enough. Across the room, another pair of eyes had fixed themselves upon the tableau by the chandelier. Edmund Blackmore, the Duke's cousin, and, until such time as a legitimate son be born, the heir presumptive, stood by the punch table in his muted olive tailcoat, turning a small crystal cup between his thin fingers. His pale blue eyes moved from Cassia to Sebastian to Isolde and back. He took a measured sip of punch. He smiled a thin smile that reached neither his eyes nor his weak chin. "Cousin," Edmund said, as he drifted past Isolde's chair, "you look a very picture this evening, quite the jewel of the room. You flatter me, Mr. Blackmore." "I speak only the plain fact, madam. It is a pity the Duke is so occupied. He is a generous host. He is a generous something." She turned her head, slowly, and regarded him. Her emerald eyes were very steady. "Do you require something of me, Edmund?" "Only your good health, cousin." He bowed, not quite deeply enough to satisfy the form. "Always your good health." He moved on. Mrs. Holloway behind the chair made a sound that might, in a less disciplined woman, have been called a snort. Isolde returned her gaze to the dancing, and the quartet drew out the last long note of the minuet, and her husband bent his dark head and said something low into Cassia Vane's ringleted ear, and Cassia laughed her small, carried laugh, and somewhere deep inside the Duchess of Blackmore, a door closed very gently that had been, up until that night, still open the width of a hand. She had not always sat so still beside pillars. 2 autumns prior, at 19, she had stood in the small chapel of her father's estate in Berkshire and watched a stranger walk up the aisle to marry her. Sir Henry Ashworth's debts had been mounting for years by then. He was a kind man, and a hopeless one, the sort who signed notes he could not pay. And a match with the Duke of Blackmore, who required a duchess and asked for little in the way of dowry, had been, as her father had put it through tears, "the making of us all, my girl, the making of us all." Sebastian had been courteous at the altar. His steel-grey eyes had rested upon her with the grave attention a man gives to a contract he intends to keep. When the vicar had bade him take her hand, he had taken it gently, and his palm had been warm, and his gold signet ring had pressed a small cold circle into her finger. He had said his vows in a clear, low voice that carried to the back pews. She had said hers in a whisper, and had been ashamed of the whisper, and had resolved that she would learn to say everything to this man clearly and without fear. She had not learned it, but she had learned to love him, which she had not intended, and which no one had asked of her. It had happened slowly, in the small gaps between a great house's hours. At breakfast he read aloud from the London papers. Dry items of Parliament, the price of wheat, a scandal in a country borough, and his voice over the silver was a low measured music that filled the cold dining room like a fire. In the stable yard he would stop on his way to his hunter and speak to the stable hands by name, asking after a mother's fever, a sister's lying in, a sore hock on a grey mare, and he would listen with a careful, still attention, as though a groom's report mattered as much as a cabinet minister's. Once, when she had stepped down from the carriage in a sudden squall of rain and had stood in a muddy puddle up to her ankle in her good slippers, he had crossed the gravel in 3 strides, lifted her bodily in his arms, carried her up the steps, set her down inside the door, and walked back out into the rain to see to the horses. He had said nothing of it afterwards. She had said nothing of it either, for she had been afraid that if she spoke of it she would weep. She had never told him she loved him. He had never once asked. In 2 years he had touched her hand at table, had kissed her brow upon her birthday, had lain beside her in the four-poster bed on perhaps a dozen nights, each time with the grave courtesy of a man performing a duty, and had slept afterwards with his back to her. She had lain awake and watched the shape of his shoulder in the dim fireglow, and had loved him, uselessly, wordlessly, with the patient, unreasoning constancy of a good hound. Now, at the edge of the ballroom, with Cassia Vane's laughter ringing out once more against the chandeliers, Isolde folded her hands still more carefully and admitted to herself, as she had been admitting for weeks, that something else had settled beneath her lace and her locket, something she had not dared name until she was certain. In the morning, she would go to the village. In the morning, she would be certain. She rose before the house was awake. Mrs. Holloway had laid out a plain dove-grey walking dress the night before, and a stout pair of half-boots and a bonnet that shadowed the face of any woman who wore it, and the two of them had spoken of the matter with only their eyes. Isolde went alone. The kitchen maid who unbarred the garden door for her did not look at her face. She had been paid in a small coin of silence years before, and paid again that morning in a kind word. The autumn woods between the house and the village were in the height of their gold. The elms were torches, the oaks were burnished copper. The path, soft with leaf fall, made no sound beneath her boots. A pheasant broke cover and whirred away in alarm, and Isolde pressed one gloved hand to her breast and laughed a small, startled laugh, and walked on. Mrs. Ferris's cottage stood at the far edge of the estate, where the wall of Blackmoor's Park gave way to common land. It was a low thatched thing with a crooked door, and a garden grown thick with sage and lavender, and the smoke from its chimney smelled of beeswax and of some herb Isolde did not know. A black cat slept upon the doorstep. The door was opened by a woman of perhaps 70 years, very small, very upright, with white hair under a clean linen cap, and eyes the colour of wet slate. "Your Grace," Mrs. Ferris said, and curtsied once, neatly, without surprise. "Mrs. Ferris, I have come... Come in, child. The kettle is on." The cottage within was a single low-beamed room, its rafters hung with bundles of dried herbs. A fire burned in a stone hearth. A scrubbed deal table held a mortar and pestle, and a small leather book. The smell of sage and beeswax wrapped itself about Isolde, and her shoulders, which she had not known she had been holding, dropped half an inch. "Sit you down," Mrs. Ferris said, "and tell me what you already know." Isolde sat. She smoothed her dove-grey skirt across her knees. She drew a small breath. "I have not bled since the feast of St. Michael. I am sick in the mornings, though I have told no one. My stays pinch where they did not pinch, and I dreamed last night that I held a boy." Mrs. Ferris nodded once, not smiling, not grave. "Lie you down upon the settle there, my lady, and let an old woman see." Isolde lay, Mrs. Ferris's hands, when they pressed gently through the dove-grey muslin, were warm and dry as a baker's. They moved with a slow certainty. They paused. "3 months, my lady," Mrs. Ferris said. "Or very near. A good strong child, by the feel." Isolde said nothing. Her hand went up to her mouth. Her emerald eyes filled. "Come now," Mrs. Ferris said, and helped her to sit. "You are a duchess. Duchesses do better than to weep upon the first news. Drink your tea." Isolde laughed, a small, cracked, helpless laugh, and wept at the same time, and accepted the cup the old woman pressed into her hands. It was chamomile. It was scalding. It was the best thing she had drunk in 2 years. "Mrs. Ferris," she said at last, "I cannot... You will not speak of this. I have delivered the children of this parish for 41 years, my lady, and buried some of them, and not one mother has had cause to fear my tongue. Go home. Tell your husband when you are ready. Eat red meat. Walk every day. Send for me when your time comes. Yes. And my lady, yes. Mrs. Ferris's slate eyes were kind. Be glad, she said. There is little enough gladness in this world. Be glad while you can. Isolde walked home through the gold woods with one hand pressed low upon her belly beneath her shawl and a great, soundless singing in her chest. She thought, a son. She thought, he will love me now, perhaps. He must. She thought, I shall tell him this very night. She was smiling when she came out of the trees and saw the great grey bulk of Blackmore Hall upon its rise. She did not see Edmund Blackmore at that same hour crossing the oak-panelled corridor towards the Duke's study with a small bundle of letters tied in ribbon beneath his arm. The Duke's study at Blackmore Hall was a room of green leather chairs and brass-studded books and the slow ticking of a long case clock. A fire burned in the grate. Sebastian stood at the long window, with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the last yellow of the afternoon lie along the park. He did not turn at the knock. Enter. Cousin, Edmund said, forgive the intrusion. I find I am not easy in my mind, and I would rather be unwelcome than silent. Sebastian turned then. His steel-grey eyes, which had warmed in a ballroom the night before, were the cool, neutral colour of a winter sea. Speak, Edmund. It concerns the Duchess. A small silence. The clock ticked. Speak. Edmund laid the bundle upon the green leather desk. His thin fingers trembled. He had practiced the tremble in a looking-glass that morning, and his pale eyes fixed themselves upon the carpet with a penitent's fascination. I had these of a footman. He had them, I am told, of one of her ladyship's women who has since left the house. I read only enough to know I could not in conscience burn them without laying them first before you. There are a great many, cousin. From Lewis. Lewis. The young man who served as estate manager last summer. You dismissed him in August. You recall. I recall. They are... Edmund swallowed. They are not the letters of a lady to a steward, cousin. They are not that. Sebastian did not move for a long moment. Then he crossed to the desk, sat and untied the ribbon with the careful motion of a man unwrapping a thing he fears may detonate. He read the topmost letter. The paper was her stationery, cream with a small violet watermark. The hand was very nearly her hand. Only a man who had watched her write her Christmas cards would know the difference. He read the second. He read the third. His firm mouth grew firmer. A small muscle stood out beneath his stubbled jaw. Leave me, he said. Cousin, Leave me, Edmund. Edmund left him. In the corridor, out of sight, the cousin permitted himself a single small exhalation and the shadow of a smile, and walked on. Inside the study, the Duke of Blackmore sat very still and read a fourth letter and a fifth. He did not crumple the paper. He did not throw the bundle into the fire. He laid each sheet down in turn, with the care of a man laying out a hand of cards that has ruined him, and when he had read the last, he rose and went to the sideboard and poured himself a glass of port and drank it without sitting. He poured a second. He drank that too. His steel-grey eyes were the colour of iron out of which all heat has gone. At supper that evening he said nothing. He spoke to Isolde only to ask her to pass the salt. He did not look at her above the candles. When she ventured at the soup, to begin, Sebastian, there is something I should like to. He cut her off with the polite small violence of a man who has perfected such things. Another time, madam. I am wearied this evening. His voice was even. His hand upon the stem of his glass was steady. He drank a third glass of port in silence and rose before the cloth was drawn. She watched him go, and she did not yet understand. And she folded her napkin and smiled at Mrs. Holloway and said, "He is tired. He rode hard this morning." "Yes, my lady." "I shall tell him tomorrow." "Yes, my lady." She climbed the grand marble staircase of Blackmore Hall after the clock had struck 10, her gloved hand upon the cool white banister, her slippers silent upon the red runner. The candles in the sconces had burned half down. The portraits of old dukes watched her from their gilt frames, severe men in wigs and lace. She rehearsed, as she climbed, the speech she had been composing since she had left Mrs. Ferris's doorstep. "Sebastian, I am carrying your child. Our child. 3 months, the midwife says. A good, strong child. I had thought to tell you tonight, but you were weary. I am so glad, Sebastian. I am so glad." She paused upon the landing outside his study. The door was closed. Beneath it lay a thin bar of yellow light. Within, she heard the small, clean clink of a decanter against a glass, and the slow, deliberate sound of a man pouring. She lifted her hand to the door. She lowered it again. Not tonight, she thought. He is in one of his silences. Tomorrow, in the morning light, over the papers. He will be kinder in the morning. She walked on, past the tall windows where the first stars had come out above the park, and into her own chamber, where Mrs. Holloway had already turned down the great 4-poster bed. Mrs. Holloway did not ask. Isolde did not tell. They undressed her in silence, brushed out the long chestnut auburn hair until it fell past her shoulders in loose curls, and the gold locket was laid carefully upon the dressing table, and the door was shut, and Isolde Ashworth, Duchess of Blackmore, climbed into her great bed alone. She did not sleep. She lay upon her back in the dim red glow of the banked fire, and she rested one small hand low upon her stomach beneath the linen, and she whispered, to the child who could not yet hear her, and to no one else at all, the first words she had dared say aloud that day. "Your father will love you," she whispered. "He must." Outside, beyond the tall, uncurtained window, the first thin snow of the long cold year had begun to fall. By morning, the snow had laid a pale skin upon the gravel of the long drive, and the rooks above the elm walk made their black shapes against a sky the colour of pewter. Isolde woke before the housemaid came to lay the fire. She lay a long while with her palm flat upon the linen at her stomach, listening to the hush that fresh snow brings to a great house, and she resolved that she would not lose her courage a second time. She would tell him at breakfast, "Sebastian, I am carrying your child." She rehearsed the sentence twice, and she rose. Mrs. Holloway came in with hot water and laid out a morning gown of soft grey wool. She did not speak above a murmur. She brushed out the long chestnut auburn hair and pinned it loosely at the nape, and she fastened the small gold locket about Isolde's throat. Her hazel eyes were lowered. "Mrs. Holloway," said Isolde, "is anything the matter?" "No, my lady." "You are very quiet this morning." "It is the snow, my lady. It puts a quiet on the house." Isolde studied the older woman's reflection in the looking-glass. There was something in the set of her jaw, some knowledge held back, but before she could ask again, a footman knocked and said that His Grace requested her ladyship in the study before breakfast and would not detain her long. "Before breakfast," said Isolde. "At your ladyship's earliest convenience," said the footman, and his eyes did not meet hers, and he withdrew. Mrs. Holloway laid down the silver-backed brush. "Go to him, my lady," she said, and that was all she said. Isolde walked the long carpeted corridor to the study. She passed the tall windows and saw the park transformed. She passed the gilt-framed dukes and did not look up at them. She came at last to the heavy oak door and knocked. "Enter," he said. She entered. The fire upon the great stone hearth was low, a sullen smoulder of black coals tipped with one small flame, and the air of the room was cold enough that her breath made a faint pale ghost before her face. The grey morning light fell flat upon the desk. Sebastian sat behind it in his deep navy coat, his cravat tied with the precision of a man who had not slept. He did not look up. "Sit," he said. She sat in the small leather chair opposite him. She folded her gloveless hands upon her lap and waited. For a long moment, he did not speak. He drew towards him a packet of folded papers tied with a red thread, and untied the thread with the slow patience of a man performing a ritual, and laid the papers in a small, neat fan upon the green leather. Only then did he raise his steel-grey eyes to hers, and there was no warmth in them, and no fury either, and Isolde understood that the fury would have been kinder. "Read these," he said. "What are they? Read them." She took up the topmost letter. The hand was a fair and careful imitation of her own. The loop of the I, the long downstroke of the Y, the small flourish at the end of yours. The page was faintly scented, as if it had been kept in a drawer with lavender. The words were not hers. They were the words of a woman writing to a lover named Louis. Meeting places, a complaint of a husband's coldness, a profession of love phrased in language Isolde would have blushed to think. She read each of the 5 letters in silence, the small fire hissing once behind her. And when she had finished, she laid the last sheet back upon the desk and put her hands again into her lap. "Sebastian," she said. Her voice was low and steady. "I have never written these words. I have never met a man named Louis. I do not know how these letters have come to you, but they are not mine. There must be some explanation. Someone has done this. The hand is yours. The hand is like mine. It is not mine. Sebastian, look at me. I swear upon my mother's grave I have never written such a thing. I could not. The sale is yours. Then it has been taken. Stolen. Sebastian. Do not, he said. Say my name again in that tone." She closed her mouth. He arranged the letters with the tip of his forefinger so that their edges aligned, and drew them away from her across the green leather as one draws a soiled cloth from a table, and set them on the corner of the desk, and only then did he raise his eyes to hers a second time, and they were the colour of iron from which every spark has been put out. "I had thought," he said, "I had married a woman of some quality. I find I have married a woman who can lie to my face in my own house. I am not lying. You will not insult me further by repeating it. It is the truth. It is not." The silence that followed was not the silence of the snow. It was a colder thing. Isolde felt the small pulse of her own heart beating in her throat, and somewhere beyond the oak door, a clock chimed the half-hour, and she understood, with a clarity that astonished her, that she had already lost. He did not strike the desk. He did not raise his voice. That was the worst of it. He spoke as he might have spoken to a steward who had been found short in his accounts, and every word came down upon her with the small, clean weight of a verdict. 2 years, he said. 2 years you have sat at the foot of my table. In that time you have given me no heir. You have given me no companionship. You have given me a silence at every meal that I had taken, in my folly for shyness. You have walked through these rooms as though they were a punishment. You have lain in my bed as though it were a duty. You have been a cold wife and a barren one. And now I find that what I had taken for modesty was merely the studied face of a woman whose attention was elsewhere. That is not— You will let me finish. She let him finish. I had thought, he said, that the fault was mine. I had thought I had married a girl too young to know how to be a wife, and that with patience she would come to me. I have been patient. And in the end the fault was that you had given your heart elsewhere before I asked for it, and you have lived these 2 years in my house upon a lie. Sebastian, you have given me no son, madam." The word barren had not yet been spoken. He spoke it now. "You are barren in every way a woman may be barren," he said. "Of issue, of warmth, of honour." Isolde's right hand moved, before she could prevent it, low across her stomach. The fingers spread and lay a moment upon the soft grey wool above her womb, and then withdrew. Her mouth opened. The words came up into her throat as if of their own accord. "Sebastian, I am carrying your child. 3 months, a good strong child." And her lips parted upon them. She did not say them. She looked across the desk at the man who had called her barren, who had not looked up when he said it, who was already arranging the forged letters into a tidier pile, and she felt rise in her throat, beneath the words, a thing harder than the words. It was pride. It was the pride of a woman who has been told she is a stain upon a ledger, and who will not kneel down and offer her miracle as proof of her worth. She thought, very swiftly, "If I tell him now, he will believe the child belongs to Louis. He will look at our son one day with these same iron eyes and wonder." She thought, "If I tell him now, the telling will be a plea, and I will not plead." She closed her mouth. She drew her hand back into her lap. She let him call her barren, and she did not correct him. He did not notice the motion of her hand. He had not been looking. "I will not," he said, "have you under this roof another night." "As you wish. You will leave Blackmore Hall before morning. There will be no carriage. There will be no escort. There will be no settlement upon you. You may take 1 suitcase and what you can carry within it. Your allowance ends today. If you contact any person associated with this house, any servant, any tenant, any tradesman, any neighbour, my solicitors will have instruction to ruin you in the courts. I have no further interest in your conduct, only in your absence. Do you understand me, madam?" "I understand you." "Then you may go." He had said all of it without looking up. He picked up his pen now and dipped the nib in the inkwell, as though she were already a matter dispatched. She rose. She stood a moment behind the small leather chair, with her hand upon its back, and she gathered into her body what little she had left to gather. And she said the words that she had not said to him in 2 years. "As you wish, Your Grace." The pen paused. He did not look up, but he heard it. She saw the small stillness of his hand. She had not called him Your Grace since the 2nd week of their marriage, when he had taken the title from her mouth with a soft laugh and said, "Sebastian," only when we are alone. The word now was a door closing. She heard it close in the air between them as plainly as if she had pulled it shut with her own hand. She turned. She closed the heavy oak door behind her with a small, precise click, and walked the long corridor back to her rooms with her chin level and her eyes dry. Mrs. Holloway was already there. The brown leather suitcase, the plain, sturdy one, not the fine French trunks bound in brass, stood open upon the foot of the bed, and Mrs. Holloway was folding a wool stocking with hands that would not be still. Word travelled in a great house upon the breath of footmen, and the older woman had been packing some 1/4 hour before her mistress reached the door. "My lady," she said, "you have heard." "I have heard enough, my lady." Isolde stood a moment in the centre of the room, and looked about her at the embroidered hangings and the great 4-poster bed in which she had lain the night before, whispering to her child, and she understood that she was looking upon all of it for the last time, and the understanding did not break her. There would be time, she thought, for breaking. There was no time now. "What have you put in?" she said. "2 of the plain dresses, my lady, the grey wool and the dark blue. 3 shifts, the warm stockings, the wool shawl, the heavy one your aunt sent at Christmas, a nightgown, a comb, the little prayer book, and the locket is about my neck, and these." Mrs. Holloway took up from the dressing table a small drawstring purse of soft leather and pressed it into Isolde's hand. The purse was heavier than it looked. It chinked softly. It is what I had put by. I had meant it for my sister's wedding in the spring. She will not miss it. She has a good man and a good cottage. You will need it more than she. Mrs. Holloway, I cannot— You will, my lady. You will take it and say no more about it. The older woman's voice did not rise, but it did not bend either. Go to Yorkshire. Go to your aunt's cottage at Thornhill. The village lies above the river beyond Ripon. I will send word when I can. Isolde looked up at the weathered, kind face above the white cotton cap, the hazel eyes wet now and unashamed of being wet. Thank you, she said. It was not enough. She bent her head and kissed the older woman's weathered cheek, and Mrs. Holloway's hand came up and rested for a moment upon the back of her neck, as a mother's hand might rest there, and Mrs. Holloway wept, silently, quickly, and Isolde did not weep at all. You will write, said Mrs. Holloway, when you are safe. You will send word to my sister at Hartwell. Not here, never here, and I shall have it from her. Promise me. I promise. They closed the suitcase together. Isolde drew on the heavy wool shawl and pinned it at her throat, and laid the gold locket outside the wool, where she could feel its small weight against her breastbone. She drew on her gloves. Mrs. Holloway, she said, leave me a quarter of an hour. I have one thing more to do. Yes, my lady. Leave me a quarter of an hour, Mrs. Holloway. I have one thing more to do. Yes, my lady. The door closed. Isolde went to the small writing desk in the window, and she drew towards her a sheet of cream paper and dipped the pen, and she wrote, Sebastian, she wrote, Sebastian. She did not write your grace. She had spent that word already that morning. You will read in this letter what I would not say to your face an hour ago. I am with child, 3 months, the midwife says. A good, strong child. The child is yours. There has never been any other man. The letters upon your desk are not mine, and one day you will know it. I have loved you, she wrote, from the first afternoon we walked together. When my slipper was lost in the mud of the lane below the orchard, and you carried me a quarter of a mile to dry ground without remarking upon it, and set me down upon the gravel, and said only that you hoped my stocking was not spoiled. I do not think you knew that I loved you then. I cannot now make you know it. I no longer wish to. I hope in some far year you will understand what you have done this morning. I do not wish you ill. I wish you the truth when the truth comes. And I wish, when it does, that it does not break you as it has broken me. She did not sign her name. She folded the letter in 3. She crossed to the great 4-poster bed and lifted the corner of the heavy mattress and slid the folded paper deep between the mattress and the boards and let the mattress down again. No housemaid would find it there. Perhaps no one would find it for many months. She straightened. She took up the brown leather suitcase from the foot of the bed, and she felt the weight of her whole life in her right hand, and she walked to the door. She paused upon the threshold and looked back. The embroidered hangings, the cold grate, the dressing table where the silver-backed brush still lay, and she closed the door behind her for the last time, and she walked down the back stairs that the servants used, and went out by the kitchen passage, where Mrs. Holloway pressed her hand once and let her go. It was twilight when she came out under the stable arch into the falling snow. The flakes were thick now and quiet, the kind that fall straight down through still air and pile without hurry. They had whitened the gravel and the box hedges and the bare elms along the drive. Isolde tightened the wool shawl about her throat, and took the gold locket into her left hand, and closed her fingers about it. She picked up the suitcase. She began to walk. The drive of Blackmore Hall was 3/4 of a mile from the great front steps to the lodge gate. She walked along the side of the carriageway, in the trodden margin where the snow had not yet covered the grass, and she did not turn her head. Behind her, the great windows of the hall were beginning to be lit one by one against the falling dusk, the long row across the south front, the high window of his study above. But she did not look. She heard the soft sound of her own boots upon the packed snow, and her breath in the cold air, and nothing else. The snow fell upon her shawl and upon her hair, and did not melt. She reached the lodge gate as the last light went out of the sky. The gatekeeper's window was dark. Isolde set down the suitcase and looked once, only once, at the great lit shape of Blackmore Hall behind her, and turned again and faced the road. A cart was coming down the lane. She heard the slow clop of a heavy horse upon the packed track, and presently, out of the falling snow, there emerged a low farm cart, heaped with winter turnips, and a man in a thick brown coat upon the box drew rein when he saw her. "Where are you bound, miss?" he said. He had a broad, slow Yorkshire voice, and he peered down at her from beneath the brim of a wet wool hat, as though he had not expected to find a lady alone at a duke's gate in falling snow, and was puzzled by it, but was too well bred to ask. She considered the question. The snow fell between them in the pause. She lifted her chin. "North," she said. "I am going north." "Aye," said the farmer, as if the word had explained everything. He shifted upon the box and made room beside him. "Up wi' ye then. There's the village 2 mile on, and the coaching inn at the cross. You'll catch the mail there, if ye've the fare. Hand us up that bag." She handed up the suitcase. He set it among the turnips with surprising care. He gave her his rough hand, and she took it and climbed up beside him, and he clucked to the horse, and the cart began to move, and Blackmore Hall fell away behind them into the white silence. He did not ask her name. He did not ask why a lady in fine wool and a gold locket was riding a turnip cart in the snow. He asked only once if she were warm enough, and when she said she was, he nodded and said no more, and they went on down the lane in the falling dark. The village coaching inn at the crossroads was a low, long building of dark stone with a yard lit by 2 lanterns. The mail coach for the north was waiting with its lamps already lit, and the steam of the horses rising white into the snowy air. Isolde paid the master her fare from Mrs. Holloway's small purse, and took her ticket and went within. The inn parlour was low and dim, and smelt of wood smoke and wet wool and mutton. She sat upon a settle by the open fire with her suitcase at her feet, and the landlady, a stout kind woman with red hands, brought her a wooden bowl of mutton broth and a piece of brown bread, and would take only a halfpenny for it. Isolde ate the broth slowly. It was hot and salty and good. The fire warmed her face. Her eyes burned with the heat and with the long day and with what the heat permitted her, at last, to feel, but she did not weep. She thought, with a quietness that surprised her, "I will not weep where any other person can see it. I will weep only where the weeping belongs to me." She finished the broth. She took up the suitcase and went out into the yard, where the guard was already calling the passengers up, and she climbed into the dim interior of the mail coach and sat in the corner by the window, and the door was shut, and the guard's horn sounded once in the cold air, and the coach lurched forward. As it pulled out beneath the inn's wooden arch, she pressed her pale face briefly to the glass. Behind her, the lit windows of the inn shrank and yellowed in the snow, and the road was already filling, the wheel tracks softening, the prints of the horses fading, the snow coming down thick and silent and impartial, until there was no road at all, only the white falling beyond the glass, and the small warmth of her own breath upon the pane, and the long dark of the north before her. The coach set her down in the lane at Thornhill on the 3rd afternoon, and for a moment Isolde did not move. She stood with her gloved hand on the wet leather of the door, and looked about her as a person freshly woken looks about a room they do not know. 3 days of jolting along frozen ruts and of strangers' knees pressed against her own had emptied her of every thought but one. She had arrived, and arrival had no meaning she could yet grasp. The village was a small thing, laid along a narrow lane between low stone walls, cottages of weathered gritstone crouched under slate roofs gone silver with lichen. A millstream ran behind them, turning an iron wheel that creaked like an old knee. At the far end of the lane stood the chapel, greystone, squat, with a square tower no higher than the elms beside it. The moor rose behind everything, enormous, its brown heather still pressed flat under the memory of snow. Somewhere beyond the tower, a curlew cried, a thin liquid note that trailed away and was not answered. She carried her brown leather suitcase and walked the length of the lane as the coachman's wheels rattled away behind her. A cat upon a stone sill regarded her with narrow yellow judgment. She asked a woman at a pump the way to Constance Merivale's cottage, and the woman, round-cheeked, flower upon her apron, a baker's wife by the smell of her, stood up straight from her bucket. "Miss Merivale's," said Mrs. Brenton. "Lord love you, my dear, you've not heard then." "Heard," said Isolde. "She was taken in October, God rest her. A fever that would not break. You'll be her niece as she used to speak of." Isolde inclined her head. She could not at that moment trust her voice. "Aye." "Well," said Mrs. Brenton, and her face softened as a loaf softens in the oven. "The cottage has stood quiet since. Mrs. Ashcroft at the vicarage has kept it swept and aired. 2 doors along, the one with the red paint and the ivy. Go you in, child, and set your case down. I shall send word to the vicar before the tea is wet." "Thank you," said Isolde. "Thank me when you've had a bowl of something warm," said Mrs. Brenton. The cottage, when she came to it, was exactly as had been promised. Ivy had climbed the lintel and the chimney in a dark green coat. The door had been painted red, a bright, obstinate red, the red of a woman who had lived alone without asking anyone's leave. The latch lifted under her thumb. Inside there was the smell of cold stone and beeswax, a small clean kitchen, a bed in a curtained alcove made up with plain white linen. A Bible lay upon a deal table beside a sprig of dried lavender. Isolde set the suitcase down upon the flags and sat upon the threshold with her back against the doorframe. She did not weep. She had left her weeping in a snowy drive in Berkshire. She watched the wind move the ivy and push a brown leaf along the path, and she let the wind take what was left of London from her shoulders. The moor breathed somewhere above the roofs. She breathed with it. The Reverend Joseph Ashcroft came within the hour, his wife at his elbow. He was a slight man, near 60, with thinning grey hair and round, wire-rimmed spectacles that slipped constantly down his nose and were pushed up again with a preoccupied forefinger. Rebecca was 2 inches taller than he, and moved in quick, decided little bursts, as though she had not yet finished one task before her hands had begun another. She carried a covered basket upon her arm. "Mrs. Ashworth," said the Reverend, and he lifted his hat. "We are most heartily sorry to meet you in such a circumstance. Your aunt was a woman we loved." "Come in, my dear, come in out of the wind," said Rebecca. "Joseph, set the basket. Where is the poker? Ah, here. We shall have a fire in 2 minutes." Within 2 minutes they had a fire. Within 5 they had a pot of tea, a crock of barley soup upon the trivet, a brown loaf sawed into slices, butter, a wedge of yellow cheese. Rebecca pressed Isolde into the chair beside the hearth, as one presses a child into a bath. "You must forgive my wife," said the Reverend. "She is a storm in a housewife's apron. There is no resisting her." "I should not wish to," said Isolde, and found that she was smiling, faintly, for the first time in some days. "You have travelled far?" he asked. and the question was offered with such delicacy that she understood at once he would ask nothing she could not answer. "From the south," she said. "My husband. I am recently widowed, sir. A riding accident. I could not remain in the house we had shared. My aunt had written to me of Thornhill many times when I was a girl. I hoped I might find quiet here." "You shall have quiet," said the Reverend, and his brown eyes were warm behind the foolish spectacles. "We are not a clever village, Mrs. Ashworth. We are a kind one. I hope you will find it enough." "Joseph," said Rebecca, without turning from the hearth, "pour the tea. Mrs. Ashworth, drink it while it is hot. There shall be time enough for speaking." Isolde drank. The tea was strong and a little smoky, and her hands, which had not stopped trembling in 3 days, stopped trembling. Rebecca watched her with the easy attentiveness of a woman who had brought 5 children into the world and had learned, long ago, to read what faces kept to themselves. Her gaze passed once over the careful drape of Isolde's travelling cloak, over the hand that rested, without thought, a little low upon her waist. Rebecca said nothing. She poured a second cup of tea and set a slice of buttered bread upon Isolde's plate. "Eat, my dear," she said. "You are eating for—" She did not finish the phrase. "For a long winter," she said instead, and smiled. Isolde looked up. The 2 women held each other's eyes a single long moment across the steam of the teapot, and a silent compact passed between them, of a sort that needed no witnesses and no pen. Isolde lowered her gaze to the bread. Rebecca reached and touched the back of her hand, once with 2 fingers, and that was all. "You shall be Mrs. Ashworth," said Rebecca, as though settling the matter, "and you shall be very welcome here." The weeks moved past Isolde as water moves past a stone. She woke to the light above the moor, and she slept to the owl in the chapel yew, and in between she learned what her hands had never been required to learn. She drew water from the well, the rope coarse against palms that had lifted nothing heavier than a fan. She scoured a pot with sand. She laid her own fire. She baked her first loaf, which came out of the hearth as a black brick, and she laughed at it, alone in her kitchen, with a short, surprised laugh, and she tried again. By the 5th she had a crust her aunt would have owned. She mended her own stockings by the window in the afternoon light, and she found she liked the small, satisfied click of the scissors when a darn was done. Her hands, that had known only silk and the cool handle of a silver fork, turned first a raw chapped pink under the cold water of the pump, and then, week by week, a steadier colour, the colour of hands that had begun to belong to their owner. A letter reached her upon a Thursday through the carrier at York. Redirected twice by a cousin Mrs. Holloway had pressed into unwitting service. The trunk that came with it held the rest of Isolde's modest possessions, a few books, 2 plain gowns, her mother's prayer book. The note was but 4 lines. "Your Grace, all is well here. The house is quiet. I burn your fires each evening out of habit. Stay hidden. I am yours always. M.H." She read it twice by the window, and then folded it into the smallest square her fingers could make, and tucked it inside the gold locket at her throat, behind the miniature of her mother. The locket had grown heavier by a paper's weight, and warmer somehow, as though Mrs. Holloway were standing at her elbow still. One afternoon in the vicarage parlour, over tea and the Reverend's meagre library, 2 shelves of sermons, a Pilgrim's Progress, a battered Robinson Crusoe, a volume of Cowper's poems, Isolde set her cup down and asked a question she had been turning for a week. "Sir," she said, "have the children of Thornhill a school?" "They have not," said the Reverend, and his spectacles slid down his nose. "We have wanted one these 20 years. I teach the brighter boys their letters of a Sunday. But it is a patchy thing. Why do you ask, my dear?" "I should like to teach them," she said, "if you would permit it. I can read and I can write a fair hand, and I have some little French. I have time." "My dear Mrs. Ashworth," said the Reverend, and he reached across and covered her hand with his. "You are an answer to a prayer I have muttered for so long I had forgotten whose ear I was pulling. The vestry is cold, but it is clean. You shall have it tomorrow morning if you wish it." "I wish it," she said. Within a month she had 12 children, a small iron stove in the vestry, a row of slate tablets upon a trestle, and a feeling in her chest she had not felt in her life, the feeling of being needed for something she could actually give. They came through the chapel yard in all weathers, farm boys with mud to their knees and red-cracked hands, tradesmen's daughters in pinafores carefully mended at the elbow. They sat upon 2 long benches and stared at her as at a marvel, and then, little by little, stopped staring and began to work. She read them Robinson Crusoe by the light of 2 tallow candles on the dark afternoons. She taught them to write their names, slow loop by slow loop, and she did not hurry them. "Please, Mrs. Ashworth," said a girl called Susan one morning, "what did Crusoe do when the goat died?" "He wept," said Isolde. "He was a man of hard sense, and yet he wept. A man may weep, Susan, and remain a man. My father says a man ought not." "Your father," said Isolde, "has not been alone upon an island. We shall read on and see. There was a boy called Ned among them, 7 years old, narrow-shouldered, serious, with eyes the colour of wet slate. He sat at the end of the second bench and spoke only when addressed. He wrote his name with his tongue caught between his teeth and breathed through his nose in a small, careful whistle. On a cold morning in February, he arrived before the others and stood in the vestry doorway with his cap twisted in his hands. "Good morning, Ned," said Isolde. "Mrs. Ashworth," said Ned. "I brought you summat." He opened his dirty, cupped palms. In the hollow lay a single snowdrop, its stem broken a little at the base, its 3 white petals folded in upon their green heart. "I found it under a stone," said Ned. "My mam said it were the first." Isolde knelt down upon the stone flags, awkwardly now, for she was growing, and took the snowdrop out of his hands as though it were a relic. "Thank you, Ned," she said. "I shall put it in water. It shall sit upon my window-sill, where I shall see it of an evening." "Will it live, Mrs. Ashworth?" 3 days, she said. "Perhaps 4. Long enough to be remembered." The snowdrop sat in a small glass of well water upon her kitchen window-sill for 3 days, and upon the 4th it drooped at last, and she pressed it between the leaves of her mother's prayer book, where it lay still. It was in that same season that Agnes Brenton began, by no plan of her own, to become Isolde's friend. Agnes was 20 years old and built upon her mother's pattern, round and quick-cheeked, with yellow hair escaping always from its pins and a laugh that carried halfway up the lane. She had the village gossip in her apron pocket like loose pennies, and she spent it freely. "Sal Tyler's marrying the farrier," said Agnes, over a pot of tea in Isolde's kitchen. "Her mother's in a pet about it, for he's 40 if he's a day, but Sal says she'd rather have 40-year-old and gentle than 20 and a fool, and I think she's in the right of it, Mrs. Ashworth, though I'll say it only to you." "You may say anything to me," said Isolde. "Then I shall say also that you've a face like Sunday morning, and it wants livening. There's a dance at Michaelmas, above the bell. You must come." "Agnes, I cannot dance." "You needn't dance," said Agnes. "You must come. You shall sit by me, and I shall name every fool that puts his foot wrong, and you shall laugh at them, which is duty enough." And so Isolde went. She wore a plain grey stuff gown let out at the waist, for she was 7 months along now, and could no longer pretend otherwise, and she sat upon a bench by the wall of the long assembly room above the inn, with Agnes at her elbow, and the fiddlers above the stairs struck up a reel that shook the floor. Agnes leaned close and whispered into her ear the history of every ankle and every nose that passed, and at length a tall, thin youth, stepped upon a fat girl's slipper and fell into a punch bowl, and Isolde laughed. She laughed aloud, from the belly, a laugh she had not known she still owned, a laugh she had not made since her wedding night, when she had laughed at something her husband had said, before she had understood what her marriage was to be. The laugh surprised her, so that her hand flew up to her mouth, and Agnes, delighted, laughed back, and the two of them rocked together against the wall while the dancers went by. Later, at the bottom of the pot, when the candles in the Brenton kitchen burned low, Agnes said, "Mrs. Ashworth, do you ever wish to speak of the husband you've lost?" "No, Agnes," said Isolde, and she said it gently. "Not yet." "Aye," said Agnes. "Well." And she poured more tea, and asked her nothing further. The storm came at the very end of April, a late spring thunder that walked across the moor from the west with a slow, heavy tread, pulling the air out of the sky before it. Isolde had felt the first tightening at noon, walking back from the vestry with a slate under her arm, and had smiled crookedly and said nothing. By 4 o'clock, the sky had gone the colour of a bruise. By 6, the first crack of thunder split over the chapel tower, and the rain came in grey sheets against the red door of the cottage, and Rebecca Ashcroft was at the latch with her basket before Isolde had bolted it. "Sit down, child," said Rebecca. "Joseph has gone for Mrs. Wharton. Mrs. Brenton is coming. The fire wants coal. Sit down." Mrs. Wharton, the village midwife, arrived within the hour, a weathered, long-jawed woman in a black, oiled cloak dripping upon the flags, with eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Isolde and another at the kettle, and she said, "We shall do very well. Fetch me the linen, Mrs. Ashcroft, and set the pan to warm." Mrs. Brenton arrived, soaked to the shoulder, and set about the kitchen as though she had been born in it, the cottage filled with the low, quick voices of women who had done this work before. The rain hammered the slates. Somewhere far over the moor, the thunder moved on and came back. Isolde laboured through the long hours of that night with the restraint she had been taught from the cradle. She bit upon a folded linen cloth that Mrs. Wharton placed between her teeth, and her jaw set upon it, and she would not cry out, would not let the village hear that a duchess in hiding had broken upon a moorside bed. The window had been set a hand's breadth open for air, and the smell of wet heather and cold rain came through it and filled the room. A candle guttered in its dish, and Rebecca lit another from its dying wick. Mrs. Wharton's voice moved below her in a steady low current. "Breathe, my lass. Easy now. Well done, well done." And the pain rose and fell as the storm rose and fell, and the hours went by her like water. Towards the very end, when her strength was nearly spent, the thunder broke at last with a long sigh over the moor, and the rain fell gentler against the thatch. A thin grey light began to pale the eastern sill, and then, upon that first grey breath of dawn, her son was born. He came into the world with the small, indignant cry of a creature that had been disturbed in good sleep, and Mrs. Wharton laughed, an old cracked laugh of pure triumph, and caught him up in the warmed linen. Rebecca stepped forward with her eyes wet and her hands steady. Mrs. Brenton sat down upon the stool and pressed her apron to her face. "A boy, my dear," said Mrs. Wharton. "A right fine boy, and all his fingers and all his toes, and a head of hair like a little crow." Rebecca carried him across the flags, and knelt by the bed and laid him upon Isolde's breast. He was small, and warm, and creased, and perfect. His hair was dark and already wavy upon the crown. His eyes, when he opened them a crack against the candle, were not the blue of newborns, but a grave, unsettled grey. The grey, Isolde saw in a rush that took her breath, of the man who had turned her into the snow. She did not think of that man, not then. She would not give him even a corner of this dawn. She bent her mouth to her son's forehead. His skin smelled of rain, and of something older than rain. She kissed him. "Thomas," she whispered. so low that only he could have heard it. "Thomas! Thomas Ashworth! My Thomas! You will never be lonely. You will never be small. You are loved. You are loved. You are loved." Across the summer that followed, the cottage with the red door grew a new voice. Thomas slept in a wicker basket beside the trestle in the vestry, while Isolde, sun-browned across the bridge of her nose, taught the older children their Latin declensions, mensa, mensa, mensum, and rocked the basket with her foot between the cases. His first laugh came in June, when Agnes leaned over the rim and made a face like a goose, and the small, astonished sound he gave seemed to Isolde the most serious music she had ever heard. In July, he reached up with both tight hands for the meadowsweet and the buttercups Agnes brought him by the handful, and he laughed again and closed his fingers upon the air and knew that the world came to him when he called. In the evenings, after the children had gone and the bread was out of the hearth, Isolde would stand at her red-painted door with Thomas upon her hip and watch the last light draw down across the moor. The chapel tower would go black against a sky the colour of honey, and the curlews would call, and the wind that had taken her grief in February would come back lighter, as though emptied of its errand. She stood so one such evening, her cheek against her son's dark hair, and a thought came to her with the quietness of a door being softly closed. For the first time in her life, in her girlhood, in her 2 long years of marriage, in her 3 terrible days of flight, she was not listening for a step upon a path. She was not counting hours until a carriage came. She was not waiting for someone to come home. She was home. She was already, entirely, home. She kissed the crown of Thomas's head, and she turned and she carried him inside, and she closed the red door against the dark. Autumn came late to Blackmore Hall that year, as if the season were reluctant to return to a house in which something essential had gone missing. The oaks along the southern avenue dropped their leaves in slow brown sheets, and the wind from the moors carried a thin, sour edge the older servants called the smell of an unhappy house. In his study, behind a desk of dark walnut he had once thought beautiful, Sebastian Blackmore sat with a glass of port at his elbow and the morning light slanting cold across his hands. The clock had not yet struck 11. He told himself, as he lifted the glass, that he was a man who had been wronged, and that a man who had been wronged was permitted certain consolations. The port did not warm him. It only blurred the corners of the room, which suited him, for he had begun to dislike looking at the corners of any room in this house. They were full of the wrong kind of silence. Above him, on the long landing, a hammer rang twice against plaster. Lady Cassia Vane was redecorating the morning room. She had not asked. She had informed him, over breakfast a fortnight before, that the wallpaper was hideous, and had written to a man in London. The man had arrived with 3 apprentices and a wagon of crates, and Cassia had received them in the front hall as though she were already mistress of the place. When Sebastian had said mildly that he would have preferred to be consulted, she had laughed and laid her hand against his cheek. "Darling, you are far too occupied to think of curtains." He had walked out into the rain. Edmund had been even less subtle. At the autumn shoot the previous Saturday, in the company of 3 viscounts, Sebastian had heard his cousin refer to himself, twice, as the likely heir to Blackmore. The first time he had pretended not to hear. The second time he had looked at Edmund with an expression that should have stripped the skin from his face, and Edmund had only smiled and reached for another glass of claret. There was a confidence in him that had not been there a year ago, and it hung about him like a cheap perfume. The servants felt it too. They moved through the corridors with lowered eyes and spoke in the small, hard voices of people who had chosen their side of a quarrel. Mrs. Holloway, in particular, had grown deliberately cold. She set down his coffee each morning with the precision of a soldier presenting arms, curtsied, and withdrew without a word. She had not met his eyes in 7 months. He drank the rest of the port and poured another, and stared at the place on the desk where his wife's letter ought to have been and was not. The seasonal airing of the linens fell in the 2nd week of October, and Mrs. Holloway, who had charge of such things, climbed the back stair to the south wing with 2 scullery maids and a basket of lavender sachets. The Duchess's rooms had not been opened in nearly a year. Sebastian had locked them the morning after Isolde left and given Mrs. Holloway the only key. She sent the maids back to the kitchens on some pretext and went in alone. The chamber smelled of cold rose water and old wood. The bed had been stripped to the ticking. Mrs. Holloway moved through it as one moves through a chapel, lifting the dust covers, opening the shutters to the thin autumn light. When she came at last to the bed, she set her basket down and began, with the slow, expert hands of a woman who had made beds for 40 years, to lift the heavy mattress for its turning. Beneath it, against the rope webbing, lay a folded sheet of cream paper sealed with a faded smear of red wax. She knew the hand at once. She sat down on the bare bedstead and held the letter in her lap for a full minute before she broke the seal. She read it through, very slowly, and then a second time more slowly still. And then she put her hand to her mouth and wept without sound. She wept for the girl who had written it, and for the child the girl had been carrying when she wrote it, and for the great, cruel man downstairs who had not known. When she was done, she folded the letter again with trembling hands, smoothed its creases against her apron, and went down the back stair. She did not knock at the study door. She opened it and walked in and stood before the desk, while Sebastian raised his head in surprise. She placed the letter upon the blotter at his elbow, square and exact, as though she were laying out a sentence. "Read this, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steady and low, and her eyes for the first time in months were on his. "Read every word." He did not at first reach for it. He looked at her instead, at the redness about her eyes and the iron in her mouth, and reached then because he could no longer not. He broke the half-broken seal the rest of the way and unfolded the page. The hand was Isolde's. He had forgotten how it leaned, how the loops trailed away into a kind of music. The date at the top was the night of her banishment. He read the salutation, and his hand began to shake, and by the 3rd paragraph, the shaking had reached his shoulders, and at the place where she told him, in a single quiet sentence, that she was carrying his child and had meant to tell him that very evening, he made a sound that was not quite a word. He read the whole of it. He read the part where she said she loved him. He read the part where she said she did not blame him for believing what he had been told, only that she wished he had asked her once, only once before he sent her into the snow. He read her signature, which was only her Christian name, written small. He sat for a long time without speaking. The clock on the mantel struck the half-hour and then the hour. At last he laid the letter flat upon the desk and pressed his palm down upon it as though to keep it from rising, and said, in a voice she had never heard him use, "Leave me, Mrs. Holloway." She inclined her head and left. He did not summon Edmund until the dusk had thickened to true dark. The library was lit by 2 branches of candles upon the long table, the fire built up against the cold. Sebastian stood behind the table with the letter in one hand and a packet of folded foolscap in the other. The forged correspondence Edmund had brought him a year before, sewn with green silk thread. He had not been able to bring himself to burn them. Now he saw why. When Edmund came in, easy and smiling, in his olive-green coat, Sebastian gestured to the table. "Come closer, cousin. Look here." Edmund drifted to the table, glanced at the papers, and the smile stiffened. Sebastian unfolded Isolde's letter and laid it beside the topmost forgery. He let the candles do the speaking. Side by side, in the gold uneven light, the 2 hands betrayed themselves. Isolde's letters leaned forward like a woman walking into wind, even and elegant, the loops drawn with a light wrist. The forgeries crouched and squatted, every letter pressed too hard, the imitation visible now in every clumsy curve. A child could have seen it. He had not wanted to see it. "Did you do this?" Sebastian said. I am not certain what you mean. Did you do this, Edmund?" "Cousin, these letters were brought to me. I told you so at the time. I cannot answer for the hand of—" "Did you do this? You cannot mean to suggest—" Sebastian took one step around the table. He did not raise his voice. He did not lift his hand. He only took the step, and Edmund's mouth came open and stayed open, and then quite suddenly, Edmund sat down upon the nearest chair as though his knees had been cut. "It was not my idea," he said. "Whose idea was it?" "Cassia's. It was Cassia's. She had old letters of yours, household letters, requests for linens and accounts. She copied from those. She practiced for weeks. I only carried them to you. You only carried them. I never thought it would. You wanted the dukedom." Edmund's pale eyes lifted. For a moment, something hard and ugly looked out of them, and then it crumpled. "Yes," he said. "God help me. I wanted the dukedom, and she wanted you, free of your wife. We agreed. You agreed to drive my wife from this house in the dead of winter. I did not know about the child. On my mother's grave, cousin, I did not know about the child." Sebastian's fists were shaking at his sides. He looked down at them with a kind of distant interest, as though they belonged to another man. He thought, with great clarity, of the satisfaction it would give him to break his cousin's jaw against the corner of the table. He thought of it for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he closed his hands very deliberately and put them behind his back. "You will be gone from this house by dawn," he said. "You will receive £100 a year and no more, paid quarterly through my London bank, and you will not set foot upon any acre that bears the Blackmore name for as long as you draw breath. If you speak of this matter to any soul living, friend, creditor, or confessor, I will ruin you so completely that the parish poorhouse will turn you away for the smell of disgrace. Do I make myself plain? Sebastian, do I make myself plain? Yes. Now get out of my sight." Edmund opened his mouth as though to say something further. Sebastian's eyes lifted to his, and whatever Edmund had meant to say went out of him like a candle. He bowed, a small, foolish reflex of a bow, and left the library, and Sebastian stood alone with the 2 letters side by side upon the table, and watched the candles gutter and burn. The household was assembled in the great hall by 9 the next morning. The butler stood in his black coat by the foot of the grand stair. The housekeeper, the cook, the 4 footmen in their livery, the stable master in his riding boots, the scullery maids, the pantry boy. They suspected what they had been called for. Sebastian came down the stair in his deep navy coat, his cravat tied without flourish, his face shaved and pale. Lady Cassia Vane emerged from the morning-room with a teacup in her hand and a frown gathering between her brows. She had not been told. "Sebastian," she said, "what is the meaning of this gathering at such an hour?" He stopped at the foot of the stair. He did not approach her. He spoke clearly, in a voice meant to carry the length of the hall, and he did not raise it once. "Lady Cassia, you will be quit of this house within the hour. Your trunks are being brought down as I speak. The carriage is harnessed. You will be conveyed to the posting inn at Marston, where you may make whatever further arrangements suit you. You will not return. You will not call. You will not write. You will not set foot upon any property belonging to the Blackmore name from this day forward. Should you attempt it, you will be turned away at the gate." The teacup trembled in her hand. "Sebastian, my love, you will not address me so. There has been some misunderstanding." "There has not." Her amber eyes filled, beautifully, instantly, as they had filled 100 times before. "How can you speak to me thus, after all that has passed between us?" He looked at the long mirror above the hall table. He did not look at her. "Sebastian Blackmore," she said, and her voice rose now, sharp and serrated. "You will regret this hour. You will regret it to the end of your days. You think she will have you back? You think she would even open a door to you? You are a fool, a great staring fool." He looked at the mirror. She faltered. She reached a hand toward his sleeve. The butler stepped, very quietly between them. On the staircase above, Mrs. Holloway stood with her hands folded over her apron and one corner of her mouth lifted, just once, into a small grim smile that no one but herself observed. Cassia's carriage rolled out of the yard before the church clock struck 10. He rode south the following morning, alone, with a change of linen in his saddlebag and the miniature of Isolde sewn into the lining of his coat. By the 4th evening, he was at the gates of Ashworth Park in Berkshire, travel-stained and hollow-eyed, and the old butler who had once carried him as a boy did not at first recognise him. Sir Charles Ashworth received him in the parlour where Sebastian had, 2 years ago, asked for the hand of his only daughter. The older man had grown thinner, his grey hair almost white at the temples. "Where is she?" Sir Charles said, before Sebastian had fully crossed the threshold. "Sir, where is my daughter Blackmore? I have not had a word from her in 10 months. 10 months, sir. I have written 6 times. I assumed you were keeping her at Blackmore, that you had—" His voice failed him. He sat down upon the edge of a chair, as though his legs would no longer hold him. "What have you done to my child?" Sebastian went to his knees on the worn Turkey rug at the older man's feet, and bowed his head, and told him the whole of it. He told it without varnish, of Edmund and Cassia, the forgeries, the night of the snow. He told of the letter beneath the mattress, and the child Isolde had been carrying when he sent her into the cold. He left nothing out, not even his own pride, which he set down in pieces upon the rug between them. When he was done, Sir Charles wept. He wept silently into a folded handkerchief, with his face turned to the fire. After a long while he reached down and put his hand upon Sebastian's bowed shoulder. "Get up, lad," he said. "We have work to do, you and I. Sir, whatever is mine, money, men, horses, the names of every cousin I have between here and the border, it is yours. You will find her. Whether she chooses to receive you is her own affair, and I will not press her, nor will you. But you will find her. Do you hear me?" "I hear you." "Then get up." He returned to Blackmore within the week, and the search began in earnest. He dispatched his most trusted stewards with sealed letters and purses of coin to every coaching inn, market town, and parish register between the Thames and the Tweed. He hired 4 runners out of Bow Street and set them upon the northern post roads. He wrote, in his own hand, to the magistrate of every county between Berkshire and Northumberland, enclosing a copy of the miniature and a careful description of the woman he had lost. He signed each letter the same: "Your most obedient and most desperate servant, Blackmore." October bled into November, and November into the first iron weeks of December. He did not sleep more than 4 hours in any night. He took his meals standing at the sideboard, often forgetting them altogether. Mrs. Holloway watched the navy coat grow loose at the shoulders and the cheekbones rise sharp beneath the steel-grey eyes. He lost 2 stone before Advent. The signet ring turned upon his finger. Mrs. Holloway watched him and said nothing. She had known from the first hour where Isolde had gone. She had stitched the address into the hem of her own petticoat the morning after the banishment and carried it there ever since. A folded square of paper with a Yorkshire village written in pencil. She had judged him, day after day, and held her peace. Now, against her will, she began to waver. She watched him stand at the long window after supper with the candles unlit behind him, watching the drive for the post. She watched him rise at 4 a.m. to ride out himself along the northern roads. She thought, against all the iron of her judgment, that he might at last be paying. The letter from Doncaster came on a grey afternoon in the first week of December. One of the Bow Street runners had stopped at the post and, by the kind of accident that is not entirely an accident when a man has been told to keep his ears open, had heard the postmaster's wife mention a letter that had passed through her hands a fortnight earlier from a Mrs. Brenton, Agnes Brenton of Thornhill, to a London cousin. The runner had charmed the cousin's address out of her, and obtained the letter itself, by means Sebastian preferred not to inquire into. The letter spoke chiefly of butter prices and a cousin's gout, but in the third paragraph Mrs. Brenton had written, in an idle countrywoman's hand, of a young widow, lately come into Thornhill, who was teaching the village children their letters and their psalms, very fine-mannered for her station, with a baby boy of 6 months at the breast. The widow's name was Mrs. Ashworth. Sebastian read the paragraph 3 times. He sat down in his chair and put his face in his hands. He did not yet ride. Ashworth was Isolde's father's name. She would have used it. But Ashworth was common in the North Country, and he had been deceived once already by what he had wished to be true. He sent the runner back to Doncaster with fresh instructions and waited. The second letter came 9 days later, on a December afternoon when the first serious snow of the season had begun to fall upon the long avenue at Blackmore. It was written in the careful, slow hand of an old man who had not held a quill often in recent years, signed Jacob Hurst, tenant, Highfield Farm, North Riding, in the service of His Grace. Old Hurst, who had been shown the miniature a month before, and who attended Thornhill Chapel on Sundays in fair weather, wrote that he had sat behind the young schoolmistress 3 Sundays running, and had observed her when she lifted her face to the light from the south window. He was an old man and not given to fancies. He had looked upon the miniature in his pocket for half a minute, and upon the lady's face for half a minute more, and believed with such certainty as his old eyes could give that they were the same woman. The child upon her hip had dark hair and grey eyes. He begged His Grace's pardon if he was mistaken, and would say nothing in the village until instructed. Sebastian stood at the long study window and read the letter through. The snow was thickening on the gravel of the drive. The yew hedges along the south walk were turning white. Behind him, Mrs. Holloway stood with her hands folded over her apron, watching him as she had watched him for a year. He did not turn. He folded the letter into careful quarters. He opened his coat and slid it inside, against the breast of his waistcoat, against his heart. Mrs. Holloway, Your Grace, have my horse saddled. I ride tonight. For the space of a breath she did not answer. Then she allowed herself at last the small, warm smile she had been keeping back for the better part of a year. A smile no larger than a thimble, but a smile such as she had not given him since the night Isolde left. "Very good, Your Grace," she said. "I shall pack your coat for heavy weather." He went out into the yard within the hour. The snow was coming down in great drifting curtains across the gravel and the cold black iron of the gate. The grooms had brought up his strongest hunter. The bay tossed his head once at the cold and stood quiet under the saddle. Sebastian mounted without speaking and turned the horse's head to the north. He did not look back at the lit windows of Blackmore Hall as he rode beneath the bare arch of the elms and into the white. The first true blizzard of December closed around him, and the road began to disappear. and he rode on alone into it, northbound, toward Yorkshire, toward the only door in England he wished to be opened to him. The road north out of Blackmore Hall had vanished before Sebastian had ridden 5 miles. The hedgerows were gone beneath a hush of white, the milestones smothered, the familiar crossroads erased as though some spiteful hand had drawn a damp cloth across a slate. He rode by memory of the country, and by the set of the wind upon his cheek, and Bellamont, the great black hunter, carried him through a world with nothing left in it but snow and a letter folded against his heart. He lay the first night at Grantham, in a low-beamed inn whose sign creaked like a wounded thing. He ate without tasting, and climbed to a cold chamber beneath the eaves. He slept 4 hours, paid his reckoning in silver, and was upon the road again while the sky was still the colour of lead. The second night he made Doncaster, though only just. Bellamont's flanks were salt white with sweat beneath the frost. The taproom smelled of wet wool and tallow and bitter ale. A square-shouldered man with a beard, the colour of rusted iron, stood behind the counter, and he looked Sebastian over, noting the fine cut of the ruined coat and the grey exhaustion of the face above it. "You'll not make it to Thornhill in this, sir," the innkeeper said. "Roads are gone. A shepherd were brought in last night, frozen stiff to his crook. Bide a day, bide 2. The weather'll break by Friday, God willing." "I thank you for the counsel," Sebastian said. "I am going on." "Man, did you hear me? The drifts past Ferrybridge are up to a tall horse's withers. There's no road, there's no track. There's only the moor, and the moor will kill ye as sweetly as kiss ye." "I am going on," Sebastian said again, and he laid a gold sovereign upon the counter for a plate of beef and a bed, and another for the ostler. "For your trouble, and your warning. I am sensible of both." The innkeeper stared at the coins, as though they were a species he had only heard tell of. "You're either a madman, sir, or a man with a reason." "A reason?" Sebastian said. "Aye, well, God go with ye then. There's not much else will." He slept 4 hours again, and woke at the first grey stirring. By noon he was in the saddle once more, and by the 3rd evening he had come, at last, into York. It was outside the walls of York that Bellamont faltered. The great hunter set down his off-fore into what looked like honest ground, and came up 3-legged, his fine head flung back in a soundless protest. Sebastian swung from the saddle and knelt in the drift, and his bare hand ran down the long tendon and found the hot swelling there, and he bowed his head a moment over the horse's neck. He led Bellamont the last mile into the inn yard at a walk that took an hour. The innkeeper came out and clicked his tongue. "He'll mend," he said, "but not under a saddle. Not this winter. Then stable him. Feed him warm mash. Have you a horse?" The innkeeper had a horse, a rangy grey gelding called Firth, 16 hands, with the ugly serviceable legs of a beast bred for the moor. He was worth, perhaps, 12 guineas on a market day with a kind buyer. Sebastian counted out 36 guineas upon the kitchen table. "Sir," the innkeeper said, "I cannot—" "You can, and you will keep my hunter alive until I return, and when I return, you shall have 36 more. Do we understand one another?" They understood one another. Within the hour Sebastian was upon Firth's broad back, the letter still folded dry at his breast, and the iron grey shoulders of the gelding set westward into a sky that had gone the colour of old pewter and lower by the minute. 20 miles out from Thornhill, the blizzard reached its full voice, the wind set its teeth into the flesh of his face and would not let go. The snow did not so much fall as hurl itself horizontally, a blinding white charge without beginning or end. The drifts rose to the height of a man's shoulder, and in one cut along a sunken lane they rose to 10 feet and more, so that he and Firth threaded a narrow, trembling trench between 2 soft white cliffs. The light had gone out of the sky. It had not set. It had been smothered, as a pillow smothers a candle, and the world had passed from grey day to grey half-night without so much as a farewell. He had taken to speaking to the gelding some miles back, when the silence had grown intolerable. "Steady, lad. Steady now. Another mile. Only another mile." Firth put his near fore into a place that should have been a road, and was instead a hidden ditch filled level with drifted snow, and the bone went with a sound Sebastian would carry the rest of his life. The gelding came down heavily, with a soft, deep groan, and Sebastian was thrown clear into the powder, and rose at once, and knelt beside the long, honest face. Firth's dark eye turned up to him without reproach. Only a question. Only, "What now, master?" Sebastian drew his pistol from his saddle holster. He primed it with fingers that did not shake, though the rest of him was shaking. He pressed the muzzle to the soft hollow above the gelding's ear, and he said, very quietly, "Forgive me, lad." And he fired. The shot went flat into the storm and was gone. He sat back in the snow beside the still warm body, and he wept. He had not wept when Isolde's letter had been laid into his hands. He had gone white and still, which was the manner of his weeping. He wept now. He wept like a boy. He wept not chiefly for the horse, but for every hour in 27 years in which he had been bidden to weep by his own heart, and had mastered himself instead. For his mother's funeral, at which he had stood dry-eyed at 10, for the quiet, terrified face of his young wife across a breakfast table at which he had never once looked up, for the cold words spoken in a cold study, for the snow into which he had cast her, for a child whose first cry he had not heard. He wept until he had nothing left in him but the cold. Then he stood. He unbuckled the saddle. He took the saddlebag with its oilskin pouch and the folded letter and his pistol, and he set his back to the wind and walked. 7 miles. He measured them in paces and in prayers. Each step was a negotiation. "I am not finished. I will not be finished in this ditch. One more pace. One more." He thought of Isolde walking down the long drive in the falling snow of last December, her brown leather suitcase in one small gloved hand, and he thought, "This is the snow I cast her into." He thought of a child he had never seen. A man who will not walk 7 miles through this for his own son is no father and deserves no name. He walked on. The cottages of Thornhill came upon him first as a scent. Peat smoke, the good sweet smell of moorland fire, then wood smoke, then the soft warm breath of cattle over a low wall, then at last the dark smudge of a roof, and another, and a lane, and at the end of the lane, set a little apart beneath a bare elm, a small cottage thatched with reed and skinned all over with ivy gone black in the storm. The snow had stopped. He had not noticed it stop. The wind was falling. In the first unbelievable stillness he could hear his own heart and the soft creak of his frozen coat, and nothing else. A single candle burned behind the little window. The door was painted red. A stranger's letter, a distant manager's hand, the one mercy Providence had not begrudged him, a red door at the edge of a Yorkshire village, one candle, and behind it, God willing, the woman he had sent into the snow. He stood before the door for a long minute. His face was raw. His beard and the dark hair at his nape were crusted stiff with ice. His coat stood about him like a carapace of frozen sailcloth, creaking with every small motion of his breath. He had ridden 400 miles and walked 7, and he did not know what he had come to say. He raised one gloved hand, and he knocked once. The door opened almost at once, not flung, not cautious, merely opened as though the woman within had been doing some small evening task and had paused in the middle of it to see who stood without. Isolde stood in the doorway with a child upon her hip. He had carried the miniature of her in his breast pocket for 4 months and composed this moment 1,000 times. None of his imaginings had prepared him for the plain, calm fact of her. She wore a grey wool dress of a severely practical cut, her auburn hair plaited into one simple coil over her shoulder, no locket at her throat. Her green eyes were the same. The set of her mouth was not. Some iron had been laid down in her that had not been there before, and it showed in the way she held her head and in the way she held the child. She did not gasp. She did not drop a hand to her heart. She looked at him the way a person looks at a ghost they have already finished mourning, without surprise and without welcome, only a certain grave attentiveness, as though to make quite sure the apparition was the one she had expected, and not another. "Sebastian," she said, and her voice was perfectly level. "You had better come in before you die in my yard." He stepped over the threshold. The warmth of the little room struck him a blow, and his knees buckled a half-inch before he mastered them. There was a low fire on the hearth, a scrubbed deal table, a dresser with blue-rimmed plates, and a red-cheeked older woman in a plain bonnet sitting upright at the table with a cup half raised to her lips. She set the cup down without spilling a drop. "Rebecca," Isolde said, without turning her head from Sebastian. "This is my husband. Will you take Thomas for an hour?" "I will, my dear," Rebecca Ashcroft said, and she rose, and she gathered her shawl, and she came forward with the easy competence of a woman who had been present at 100 small crises of village life. She took the child from Isolde's hip and settled him upon her own, and she looked once at Sebastian, not unkindly but measuringly, and then she went out through the back passage. "I'll bring him back in an hour, my dear," she said at the door. And then the latch clicked, and they were alone. Isolde closed the front door and drew across the bolt. She held out her hand for his coat without touching him, and he fumbled with the frozen buttons and at last shrugged the stiff thing off, and she laid it upon the stone flags where it might drip without spoiling her rug. She drew out a plain grey woolen blanket and set it around his shoulders, her fingers never touching his skin. She drew a chair close to the hearth and motioned him to it. He sat. She set the kettle upon the hook and swung it over the flame. She took down a brown earthenware pot and measured out tea with the quietness of a woman who had decided, long since, what she was and what she was not. She poured out a cup of strong black tea and set it into his hands, and for an instant her knuckle brushed his frozen knuckle, and she drew her hand back as though she had touched a hot iron, and the colour rose in her cheek and was gone. "Drink this," she said. "Then you may tell me why you have come." He drank. It scalded him back into himself. He watched her move about the small room, and he did not speak, because she had not given him leave to speak. Presently there came a soft tap at the back door, and Rebecca Ashcroft came in again with Thomas still upon her hip, rosy with the outer air. Isolde took the child and thanked her, and Rebecca slipped away without a word, and left them. Isolde sat down in the chair opposite Sebastian, with the child upon her knee, and for the first time she allowed him to look. The boy was 9 months old and robust, with round clean cheeks under his knitted gown. His hair, dark, wavy, curled at his temples. His eyes were grey, not the hazel of his mother, nor any borrowed grey, but that particular pale steel Sebastian had seen only in one other face, which was the face he shaved each morning. The boy looked at his father with a serious, considering attention, as a magistrate might look at a stranger brought before the bench, and he did not smile. Sebastian's hands began to shake where they rested upon the blanket. He set the empty teacup upon the flags, because he was not sure he could hold it. He drew one trembling hand halfway across the small distance between them, and checked it. "May I—" he began, and his voice failed him, and he began again, and could not finish. "No," Isolde said. Her voice was not cruel. It was only exact. Not yet. You may look at him. You may not yet hold him. You have not yet earned that. He nodded. He could not speak. He looked for a very long time, at the small, fierce, serious face of his son, the dark crown of his head, the small starfish hand open upon the grey wool of his mother's dress. And the tears rose in him again, quite unbidden, and spilled down his unshaven cheek, and he did not lift his hand to wipe them. Thomas watched the tear travel. He reached up with the grave curiosity of a creature who has not yet learned grief, and he touched it with one small, chubby forefinger, as though it were a curious raindrop that had come in out of the storm. His finger was warm. It was the first of his son's warmth that Sebastian had ever known. Isolde watched without speaking. After a time, she gently drew the child's hand back and settled him against her shoulder, and by slow degrees the boy's head grew heavy, and he slept. She rose and laid him in a wicker basket by the hearth, padded with a folded quilt, drew a blanket over him, and came back and sat down opposite Sebastian and folded her hands in her lap. Now, she said, you will hear me. He bent his head. You accused me of adultery, she said, upon the word of your cousin, whom I know now to have been a liar, and upon the look of a woman whose name I shall not speak in this house. You did not ask me. You announced me. You called me barren, in a room in which a child of yours was already breathing beneath my heart. I tried to tell you. You silenced me. You turned me into the snow without a carriage and without a servant, in December carrying your heir. I did not write to you because I had learned, Sebastian, long before that night, that writing to you was the same as writing to a wall. She paused. She did not raise her voice. The fire ticked in the grate. I cast myself out as much as you cast me, she said, because I had already ceased to believe that you would ever listen. That is my share, and I own it. I walked because staying had become a slower death. He lifted his head to speak. She stopped him with the smallest motion of her hand. In this village, she said, I am Mrs. Ashworth. I am a widow. I teach 6 children their letters in the chapel vestry every afternoon but Sunday. I bake my own bread. I mend my own linen. I have a son, whom I have brought through teething and croup, and a fever that nearly took him in August, alone, by the light of a tallow candle, without a doctor, and he lived. I have become a woman who does not wait at a window for a man to come home. Her voice did not tremble. I do not hate you, she said. Hatred would be a kind of keeping. I do not keep you. What I shall say is colder and worse. I do not need you. I have learned to live without you. I can go on living without you until the day I am laid in the Thornhill churchyard, and Thomas will grow, and Thomas will be educated, and Thomas will be loved, and the want of you will not make a crack in any of it. She drew in one long breath. If you have come here expecting to set me upon a horse behind you and carry me back to Blackmore Hall, you have misunderstood the situation entirely. I am not going back. Thomas is not going back. This cottage is our home. If you wish to be part of this life, you will earn it on my ground, by my terms, for as long as it takes me to decide. And I will decide, Sebastian. Not you. I learned to live without you. Do not mistake my hospitality for reconciliation. She stopped. The fire settled a log. The kettle ticked upon the cooling stone. Sebastian sat with his hands open upon his knees. He did not protest. He did not argue. He had ridden 400 miles and walked 7 through a blizzard that had killed his horse to hear this speech. And he took it as a man, takes a sentence from a just bench. I will do anything you require, he said at last. His voice was quite low. I will stay as long as you permit me to stay. I will leave the moment you tell me to leave. I ask no more than the air you allow me to breathe in this village. I make no claim. I have no claim." She looked at him a long time. The fire moved in her eyes, and behind the fire, something else moved that he could not read and did not presume to read. "Then you will sleep at the Crown Inn tonight," she said. "Mr. Pickering will find you a room. You will call upon me at 10 in the morning if you wish, not before. You will bring no gifts, no letters, no apologies, only yourself. The rest we shall see about." "Yes," he said. "Now go," she said, "before I remember how tired I am." He rose. He folded the borrowed blanket and laid it upon the chair and took up his stiff coat from the flags and drew it on. He did not reach for her hand because she had not offered it. He bowed to her instead, not the short nod of a husband to a wife, but the long, full bow of a subject to a sovereign, from the waist, his dark head lowered until his hair fell forward over his brow. He met her eyes once. He did not speak. He turned and walked out into the new cold night, and the red door closed behind him with a soft, firm click that had in it no anger, only finality. Isolde stood a moment upon the flagstones. Then she went to the hearth and knelt, and looked at her sleeping son in his basket, and laid her hand for an instant upon the small warm back, and rose again and went to the little table and sat down. She sat very still. Her hands rested upon the scrubbed wood. The kettle ticked softly on the cooling stone. A coal fell in the grate. Outside, somewhere far off across the moor, a single dog barked once and was silent. She laid one hand flat against her chest, high up where the old locket had used to lie, as though to keep her own heart from doing something foolish. She closed her eyes. She did not know yet what she would do. She did not know whether the man who had bowed to her like a sovereign would in 6 months be a husband she had taken back upon her own terms, or a figure walking away down the lane for the last time. But she knew, with the iron clarity she had earned in a Yorkshire year, alone, by a tallow candle, at a child's fevered bedside, that she was the one who would decide. And that for tonight was enough. The morning came up over the Yorkshire dales in a pale, uncertain gold. At 10:15, Sebastian Blackmore stepped out of the Crown Inn into the lane, his jaw newly shaved, his hair combed back with water from the tin basin in his upstairs room. He wore not the navy tailcoat he had arrived in, but a plain wool coat of a sober russet cut, such as any country gentleman might wear, and beneath it a linen shirt without embroidery and a cravat tied simply, without art. He carried nothing in his hands. She had said to bring nothing, and he had taken her at her word. He walked the short distance through the village past the baker's window, where loaves were cooling on a board, past the blacksmith's open door and the smell of hot iron. By the time he reached the red-painted door of the ivy-covered cottage at the end of the lane, the church bell had just begun to strike 10. He did not knock at the first chime. He waited until the 10th had faded into the stillness of the morning. Then he lifted his hand and knocked twice, neither loud nor timid. Isolde opened the door. She wore a grey wool dress of plain cut, the hem a little frayed at one edge, and a clean white apron tied at her waist. Her chestnut auburn hair was braided and coiled at the nape of her neck, and a single pale strand had escaped at her temple. There was flour on her right wrist, a soft white dust of it where she had pushed back her sleeve. Her emerald eyes rested upon him, and rested still, and he did not fill the silence, for he had learned at last that silence between them was something they both had a right to. "You may come in," she said. He inclined his head. "Thank you." She stepped back from the doorway, and he entered, ducking a little under the lintel. The cottage smelt of fresh bread and wood smoke, and something herbal drying in a bunch from the low rafter. A child's wooden toy lay on the flagstones near the hearth. Thomas himself was asleep in a small cradle beside the fire, one hand curled against his cheek. Sebastian looked at the cradle for a long moment, and then looked away, as though to study it too long were an intrusion upon some territory he had not yet earned. She led him to the small kitchen table, a scrubbed pine table with 2 plain chairs, and motioned him into the farther one. From the hob, she lifted a brown earthenware pot and poured tea into 2 cups that did not match. She set one before him. She sat. "The wind was high last night," she said. "It rattled my window," he said. "Mr. Pocklington tells me it will turn tomorrow." "It generally does when he says so. He reads the sky better than the almanac." "I am glad to hear the village has its oracles." A flicker, almost a smile, moved at the corner of her mouth and was gone. "The chapel roof took some of the wind," she said. "Reverend Ashcroft was out this morning at first light, looking up at the slates and shaking his head." "Is it very bad?" "Above the south transept, he says. The rain comes in upon the pews." "Ah." She turned the cup in her hand. "And Thomas has taken a liking to oats with a little honey stirred in. Rebecca brought the honey yesterday. He will eat nothing else now. A discerning palate. A stubborn one. He comes by it honestly," Sebastian said, and then, hearing himself, regretted the nearness of the sentiment, and looked down into his tea. She did not answer that. She rose and set a plate of plain biscuits between them, and they spoke for a quarter of an hour of the weather, of the chapel roof, of what Thomas had been eating, of the schoolmaster's cough. They did not speak of Blackmore Hall. They did not speak of Edmund, nor of Cassia, nor of the miles he had walked in snow. They spoke instead of small things, and it was the most honest conversation they had ever had. For every small thing was a small thing freely given, and nothing between them now was held hostage to rank. At 11 he rose and said that he would not overstay, and she inclined her head without rising, and he let himself out. The Crown Inn sat at the low end of the village, a squat, 2-storied building of grey Yorkshire stone, its windows set deep into walls 3 feet thick. A fire was kept lit always in the common room, for the landlord, Mr. Pocklington, maintained that a cold hearth was a bad advertisement. Mr. Pocklington himself was a lean, sandy-haired man of 40 with a careful civility about him. He addressed Sebastian as Sir, never as Your Grace. He did not bow, and he did not linger. The room Sebastian had taken was on the upper floor, at the end of a low-beamed corridor, and he was obliged to stoop a little to pass through its door. Within were a narrow rope-sprung bed with a bolster and 2 coarse linen sheets, a washstand with a tin jug, a plain oak chair, a small writing table set beneath the single window, and a hook on the back of the door for his coat. The window gave out upon the lane, and from it he could see, when he chose to look, the ivy-wound gable of Isolde's cottage a half-mile off, and the grey ribbon of smoke rising from its chimney. He wrote letters each evening by the light of a tallow candle. He wrote to Mrs. Holloway at Blackmore, inquiring after her health and instructing her in the management of the house, and she wrote back, in her round, careful hand, that all was well, and that she prayed nightly for her lady. He wrote to Sir Charles Ashworth, Isolde's father, a brief and formal letter confessing his errors and saying that he would make no claim upon either the father or the daughter beyond what the daughter herself chose to grant. Sir Charles did not reply at once, but in time he did reply, and his reply was not unkind. And he wrote to his solicitor in London, a Mr. Harding of Lincoln's Inn, instructing him to begin, quietly, upon no account to be spoken of, the process of petitioning under the King's Bench for the formal legitimation of Thomas Ashworth Blackmore. He set down his reasons plainly: that the child was his, that the child would be acknowledged, that whatever course the child's mother might determine upon as to the marriage, The child himself should not be made to bear the cost of her choosing. Mr. Harding was to proceed regardless of any reconciliation. This Sebastian sealed with the Blackmore crest and sent south by the next mail. He did not tell Isolde about the petition. That was a thing he had decided. She should learn of only when it was done, so that she could not mistake it for a bribe. On the third morning of his stay in the village, he called upon Reverend Ashcroft at the vicarage. He was shown into the small study, which smelt of pipe smoke and old leather, and the vicar greeted him with his usual quiet warmth and set out the brandy decanter, which Sebastian declined. "Sir," said Sebastian when they were seated, "I came to ask in what manner I might be of use here. I will not idle. I will not sit in an inn and write letters and contrive reasons to pass by Mrs. Ashworth's door. I should be sorry to become a nuisance in this village. Tell me where my hands may serve." The vicar considered him a long moment over the rims of his round spectacles. His thin fingers worked the stem of his pipe. "The chapel roof," he said at last, "has a leak above the south transept. I am too old to go up there, your grace, and young Will Ramsay has broken his arm mowing in September, and we cannot afford a proper roofer out of Leeds until the spring collection." "Then I shall go up this afternoon," Sebastian said. The vicar blinked. "You, your grace." "I am not your grace here," Sebastian said. "I am a man who owes your wife a kindness for the tea she did not deny me, and a larger kindness to her friend. If you will find me a slate hammer and a man who knows slate, I shall go up this afternoon." The vicar set down his pipe. "Very well," he said. "I shall send for Hob Tempest." Hob Tempest was a village mason of 50 summers, broad as a cart-horse, with hands like kippered leather, and a Yorkshire speech so broad that Sebastian caught one word in 3 for the first day, and by the 4th understood him near enough. Hob showed him how a slate was hung upon its nail, how the overlap was reckoned, how the flashing at the valley must be dressed. Sebastian, stripped to his shirt-sleeves, learned in silence. He skinned the knuckles of both hands on the first afternoon. On the third, a cold rain blew across the moor, and he came down from the roof soaked and shivering, and Mr. Pocklington, without comment, set a mug of hot ale upon his table and built up the fire. From her cottage garden, Isolde watched, pretending not to. She carried her basket of winter greens along the path, and paused at the gate and did not look up at the chapel roof. And yet she did look up once, quickly, and down again, and her colour rose a little. Agnes Brenton, who was pegging sheets upon a line 3 gardens distant, marked this, and came through the gap in the hedge with a clothes peg still in her mouth. "That man," said Agnes, taking out the peg, "has not been a duke for 4 whole days, Mrs. Ashworth, only a fool." Isolde did not answer, but she smiled, a small, unwilling, inward smile, and bent to her basket of greens, and Agnes went back through the gap in the hedge satisfied. The weeks gathered as weeks do in a country place, one upon another, without spectacle. February gave way to March. March thawed into April. The sloe blossomed in the hedges. The beck ran full. Sebastian remained at the Crown Inn. He did not take other lodging. He did not propose to. He called upon Isolde each morning at 10, and he left her each morning by 11, and he did not overstay by a single quarter of an hour. He did not presume. He did not touch her, not so much as her hand at the door. He sat at her kitchen table and drank her tea, and spoke of small things, of Thomas's first tooth, of the price of wool at the Ripon market, of the snowdrops at the edge of the churchyard. And in all those weeks he did not once utter the word forgiveness, nor the word return. He learned, slowly, to hold his son. At first he took the child from Isolde's arms, as though he had been handed a thing of porcelain. His hands were stiff, his elbows wrong. Thomas regarded him with round, unblinking steel-grey eyes and tolerated the indignity. By the 6th week, he had taken to gripping a handful of Sebastian's cravat in his small fist, as though to ensure his father would not escape. In March, Thomas took his first tottering steps. He had been clutching the edge of Isolde's chair, wobbling upon the little fat legs, and Sebastian had knelt some 6 feet distant, his hands held out. Isolde, without speaking, had released her grip upon the child's petticoat. The boy had swayed, considered the distance, and then, with the grave and terrible solemnity of the very young, had set out across the flags. 4 steps. 5. He had landed in Sebastian's arms with a crow of triumph, and Sebastian had held him very tightly and had not, for a long moment, looked up at the mother. When he did look up, her eyes were wet. But she said nothing, and he said nothing, and the thing was allowed to pass. He brought her at last one small gift. It was not a jewel, it was not a length of silk. He had ridden 15 miles to York upon a borrowed hack in a cold March wind, and had gone into a bookseller's near the Minster, and had purchased a plain blue-bound copy of Mansfield Park, a novel she had once mentioned in passing the summer before everything had broken, as one she had heard praised but never read. He gave it to her upon a Thursday afternoon, at the door, as he was leaving. He did not make a ceremony of it. He drew it from beneath his coat and put it into her hands. "I thought of you," he said, "when I saw it." She opened the flyleaf. In his plain hand, without flourish, there was written one line: "For the woman who taught herself to read alone." She closed the book. She did not look up at him for a long moment. When she did, she said only, "Thank you, Sebastian," and shut the door. She did not cry in front of him. She cried that night, after the candle was out, with the book pressed against her chest and her face turned into her pillow, very quietly, so that Thomas should not wake. It was in that same week that a letter came to the Crown Inn from Mrs. Holloway, written in haste, with a second smaller note enclosed. Sebastian broke the seal at his writing table and read it through twice by the tallow candle. Edmund, from his small exile upon his annuity, had attempted one last scheme. He had sought to bribe a clerk in the office of a London conveyancer to produce a forged cancellation of the Blackmore entail, whereby, upon Sebastian's death, without legal male issue, the estate should pass to him, Edmund, free of any claim. The clerk had taken the money, and within a fortnight had taken fright and had laid an information. The Bow Street runners had gone down to Southwark in the grey dawn, and had Edmund out of a lodging-house in his shirt-sleeves, and he was now confined in the Marshalsea awaiting the sessions. Sebastian read the letter without change of expression. He took up his pen. He wrote, "Let him stand trial. No mercy and no intervention. He will not receive a penny further of our money." He signed it, sealed it, and laid it aside for the morning mail. The enclosed note was shorter still. Lady Cassia Vane had bestowed her hand upon a Sir Miles Fenton, a widower of 74 years and modest fortune, and had retired with him to his estate in Somerset. Mrs. Holloway permitted herself, in a final line, to observe that it was a tolerably just ending. Sebastian allowed himself the smallest and grimmest of smiles and folded the note away. The matter was closed. In April, upon an afternoon when the willows by the beck had begun to show their first pale leaf, there came another letter to the inn from Lincoln's Inn. It bore the red seal of the King's Bench. Sebastian carried it unopened to his room. He stood for some minutes looking out over the lane. Then he broke the seal and read. The petition was granted. Thomas Ashworth Blackmore, by royal instrument, under the hand and seal of the court, in perpetuity, was declared legitimate issue of Sebastian Blackmore, 6th Duke of Blackmore, and heir presumptive to the dukedom and to all entailed estates thereunto belonging. No future action, whether of marriage or of no marriage, could alter this status. The child was safe in law. It was done. Sebastian sat a long time at the little window. Then he rose and took his hat and walked through the spring afternoon to the red-painted door. She opened it with Thomas upon her hip. He said nothing. He simply placed the folded letter into her free hand. Upon such an afternoon, she stood at the low window of her cottage, with Thomas settled upon her hip. He was 1.5 years old now, and growing heavy. Her hand rested upon his back. She was looking down the lane. At the foot of the lane, a figure had turned in from the road. He was walking without haste. He carried in his left hand a small, untidy nosegay of wildflowers from the moor, and in his right a folded letter, sealed, which had that morning come to the Crown Inn, the final written confirmation from the King's Bench that the legitimation of Thomas Ashworth Blackmore had been formally recorded in perpetuity. She watched him approach. She did not move. She did not call out. She did not go to the door. She stood very still at the window, her cheek bent a little toward her son's warm head, and she let him come. He reached the red door. He stopped upon the step. He did not knock. He looked up at the window, at the woman standing there in her grey dress with his son in her arms. And he waited. For a long moment she looked back at him. Then she stepped away from the window. He heard the latch. The door opened. She did not say come in. She did not say welcome. She stood upon her threshold with Thomas upon her hip, and she spoke, very quietly, very clearly, as she had rehearsed speaking in the silent dark of many nights. "I will not return to Blackmore Hall," she said. "If you would be my husband again, Sebastian, you will be a husband in Yorkshire. You will keep the inn-room. You will call upon us properly. And when I am ready, Sebastian, and not before, I will come to you. Do you accept these terms?" He did not hesitate. "Yes," he said. "I accept every one of them." She nodded once. She stepped aside. She let him in. 3 years passed. Behind them ranged the village schoolchildren, scrubbed to a painful shine in their Sunday best, and among them, taller than the rest now, stood the boy Ned, who had been the first to read aloud to Mrs. Ashworth from a primer 4 winters before. Isolde wore a pale blue gown of her own making, simple of cut, without lace, without silver thread, without any ornament save her mother's gold pinky ring upon her right hand and a sprig of gorse pinned at her breast. Her hair was loose beneath a plain straw bonnet. Her emerald eyes were dry and clear. Sebastian stood at the rail in a plain wool coat of dark grey, without embroidery, without the ducal signet, only a wedding ring ready in his palm. His dark hair was a little greyed at the temples now. His jaw was shaved clean. Thomas, 4 years old, stood very gravely between them with the ring upon a small square of blue silk. He had been, but she